let me share my screen with you. And I hope you can see it. No, you can't see it yet, but now you should be able to see it.
Perfect.
And you also see that the sky is not as blue as it might seem in Marburg. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 to 15 minutes is a topic that is very much related to the topics that Iain and Irene have been talking about a minute ago. I am going to talk about how to disclose what I call corporate goodness. And the term corporate goodness is just standing for the terms sustainability, but also ESG and those other terms that are so difficult to describe and really to make somehow accessible. And what I try to show is a comparison of various regimes that serve to inform both customers and investors on this corporate goodness. So let me start by a very simple story. Imagine that you buy a T-shirt in some department store, and what you get is a receipt. But this receipt that you get is different from the usual receipts. If you take a closer look, you see that there's not only the price on this receipt, but also various ESG factors. The amount of raw materials that have been used, the impact on the CO2 on climate, also the consumption of water and energy, and so forth. So what happens here is a mechanism to signal the production process of this T-shirt, and also the impact that this production has on the environment, but also on social and other fields. So what the function of this receipt is to signal various factors that are somehow embedded in the T-shirt. Its sustainability, its impact, the question whether it has been recycled or not, its climate impact, and so on and so forth. Now, the more fundamental story behind that is that there is a change in the general public, both among consumers and among investors. And what is important to them is not only the price, but is also the impact. Purpose-driven shareholders and stakeholders, but also responsible consumers, take their decision to make investments or to buy products, also on the basis of social, ethical, and ecological track records of corporations or of products. So creating a business case for good corporate behavior is something that might also create economic benefits for good companies. It's not only something that runs contrary to the profits, but that might also be an advantage on markets, because many of those consumers and investors take a look at that, and it's an important element for their decision, so that good companies might in the end have an advantage on markets, both on financial markets, but also on product markets. Now, the question is how to signal good corporate behavior. The focus now turns from products like T-shirts to companies. The focus is on the goodness of companies. And there are, of course, a variety of criteria in order to measure this corporate goodness. And most of them have already been mentioned in the talk before. It's about environmental factors, social factors, and also governance factors. And the broader term corporate sustainability also plays a role here. Now, these factors are quality attributes in times of climate change and social and ecological challenges. They are important attributes because consumers and investors are concerned, and because they pay attention to these attributes. Now, the individual preferences of both investors and consumers are somehow different. Some of them pay attention to ecological factors, others pay attention to social factors. So it's very difficult to assess and measure this variety of elements. And moreover, it's very difficult to measure them because it's non-financial, it's of a non-financial nature, and therefore so difficult to measure. In some, these factors are a kind of hidden information. It is not easy for both consumers and investors to take it into account because they cannot really distinguish good and bad companies, as they cannot distinguish easily good and bad T-shirts or other products. So there's a risk for a market for lemons here. And therefore, legal systems are very intensively occupied with developing instruments of signaling good corporate behavior, which might then be a means to overcome this potential market imperfection. And there are various instruments to do so. One of them has already been mentioned. It's ESG reporting, as embedded, for instance, in the non-financial reporting directive, which applies only for very large companies, but which provides for a reporting mechanisms on this various sorts of non-financial information. Another mechanisms are ESG ratings, and I think they will also be mentioned today. But I want to focus on a third mechanism, which is certification of companies. A certification mechanisms, as we know it in other markets, as we know it with products, for instance, where third-party certifiers have a look at the quality of products. And I want to argue that similar mechanisms can be applied to the corporate sphere as well. In fact, we can observe an emergence of certification schemes worldwide. The most well-known one is probably the US scheme of B-Lab, which certifies corporations as certified B corporations. You might already have seen this little trademark here. But various other countries have developed similar schemes. In the UK, for instance, the social enterprise mark, or also the certified social enterprise regime. In France, there's another regime called ESSS or ESAS, and also in South Korea and other Asian countries, there is some sort of social enterprise certification. Now, the question really is how to design such schemes, and there are initiatives in order to establish certification schemes on an international, on a transnational level. I have been running one of these research projects, which was funded by the German Research Foundation, called Zertifizierung nachhaltiger Kapitalgesellschaften, certification of sustainable companies, and the book is going to come out in a few weeks. Another initiative is more interesting for Spain, I guess. It's a Ibero-American initiative run by CEGIP and also funded by the UNDP. It has a somewhat broader focus on purpose-driven companies, but one element is to design a certification regime for both South American but also Ibero-American countries, and also Spain and Portugal. Of course, this will only be a recommendation to the various member countries, but it is expected to have quite a large impact. Now we have to think about two sorts of comparative questions. First, how do the various instruments relate to each other? Reporting, rating, but also certification. Does any of them provide better signals than the other? How efficient are the signals that these instruments give? But then also within the certification regimes, we have to compare them, and we have to think about how to properly design those regimes. And that depends on various questions. Which corporations are within their scope? Which procedural or also substantive requirements decide upon the certification? And what are the details that are enter into the certification process? So a first step in order to design a effective disclosure or certification regime is to compare and to map the various certifications regimes that are out there. And if you have a look at them, they differ quite substantially. The first difference is very remarkable because some of these regimes are public regimes, South Korea, France, for instance, whereas other are entirely private. There's no legislative basis, there's no responsibility of any public bodies involved. Examples for these private regimes are, in particular, the US regime, but also those two UK regimes that I have mentioned. If we look at the details of procedural design, the assessment differs. Some of the regimes are of an approval nature. The third-party certifier approves the companies, whereas others are entirely based on a self-certification, on a promise, if you want. The company promises to be good, but that is not certified. For example, in the Social Enterprise UK regime, that is the case. In addition, the certification terms vary from annual systems up to 5 years certification or even perpetual regimes like in South Korea. And then also the fees differ quite substantially, whereas in public schemes, they are comparatively low, purely administrative fees. In private schemes, they can be quite substantial, up to $50,000 in the US regime. More importantly, the substantive criteria are very different. Which kind of legal forms are concerned, which business models are assessed, what about the governance structures? Is there only a requirement of reliable, transparent governance, or even independent? And finally, also the requirements with regard to the financial order of the companies differ substantively. Last but not least, the legal effects are different. And that is quite obvious because in a public regime, you can attribute other legal effects to such certification than in an entirely private regime. In any event, you have to make sure that unauthorized use of the certificate is prohibited. And that is done in public schemes by explicit legal prohibitions, whereas in private schemes, it is affected by trademark or unfair competition protection. In addition, some of the public regimes have other effects and advantages beyond the marketing effects of a authorized use of the certification symbol. For instance, easy access to public finance, tax benefits, subsidies, and public procurement advantages. But that is not necessarily the case, but only to be found in some of the public certification schemes. Now, what is the conclusion? What is the way forward? I and actually also my colleagues, we think that the best way to go forward is to create a hybrid regime, because both public and private regimes have advantages but also disadvantages. Public regimes are maybe more trustworthy at first sight because a public certifier is less prone to the incentive of receiving as much fees as he could, whereas on the other hand, private schemes have the advantage of more expertise, of more experts sitting on their bodies, and they are also more flexible and can develop their certification criteria more flexibly, and they can adapt it to new requirements and to new preferences of investors and consumers. So we think that a hybrid regime could combine these two advantages. It would consist at an upper level of a public accreditation for certifiers, but the certifiers themselves would be private institutions. So private institutions offering certification services, but authorized and also supervised by a public body. This is different to the existing regimes because those in the UK and the US are entirely private, and those in France and South Korea and elsewhere are entirely public. But I think the combination of both could work much better. There are, in fact, also examples of such cross-border hybrid systems of certification, not in the field of corporate certification, but in the field of product certification. And one of them is the European regime for technical safety of products. So what is the next step? It will be a more in-depth research on such a hybrid regime. And the challenge is really to evaluate which regulatory design fits best for given socio-economic conditions. It is necessary to create a certification regime that creates a high level of trust, both with consumers and investors. And there we are. I think the 15 minutes are run out. I thank you for your attention and stay tuned.